Hello everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation and your time. My name is Markus Spöhrer and I'm a researcher at the University of Tübingen in Germany. And I've been researching accessible game history for quite some time now. And there is comparatively little historical material or sources to be found on this topic, probably because in the earlier decades of gaming, like the 70s and 80s, both disability and gaming weren't a relation that journalism, game magazines, or the public in general were aware of. Yet one name keeps turning up in historical material on game controller accessibility, and that is Ken Yankelevitz. And today I would like to introduce you to his pioneering work. Starting in the 1980s, he began the non-commercial production of accessible game controllers. I will trace how Ken Yankelevitz, in collaboration with rehabilitation patients and different kinds of gamers, developed customized accessibility devices. I will also show you some of the affordable and standardized devices he distributed through his company KY Designs in 1981 to 2011. And finally, I turn to the QuadStick by Fred Davison, which is a continuation of Ken Yankelevitz's work. Now, issues of accessibility in gaming hardware and software have been present since the medium entered the mass market in the early 1970s. And unlike today, accessibility was not supported by the video game industry, likely due to the economic considerations and the assumption that disabled players did not represent the profitable market, or they weren't just not aware of them. Instead, disabled individuals, computer enthusiasts, local gaming communities, and small independent companies took the initiative to make games more accessible. Although accessibility solutions for the relatively simple systems of the 70s and 80s would have been feasible at an industrial scale, they remained largely undeveloped. Nevertheless, the history of accessible gaming is rich and complex, encompassing not only the barriers faced by disabled players, but also creative workarounds, such as modding, hacking, and alternative input practices. For example, as you can see here in this slide, modifications like the left-hand attack of an Atari controller or a simple adjustment using everyday objects could significantly improve usability. So as you can see here, this Atari controller is modified with a rubber band and a pen as to improve pushability, so to speak. Well, in the early years of gaming, like the 70s and maybe the early 80s, a wide variety of controller types for gaming existed, enabling different playstyles and accommodating diverse player bodies. If you only think of all the gimmicky and sometimes really weird controllers that can be found in early Pong consoles, you probably know what I mean. These controllers sometimes could be played with one hand, with feet, with the elbows, and in some cases experiments with speech input were even made. But with the introduction of the Atari VCS 2600 and the CX40 joystick, however, a standardized input scheme was established for the first time. And this implied a specific type of player body, namely one with two hands and thumbs, a certain level of strength and physical coordination. And this standard quickly spread across multiple video game and personal computer systems, and thus consequently marginalizing alternative forms of access and excluding certain groups of players. Well, as I told you, a historically relevant example and presumably one of the first professionals in gaming accessibility is Ken Yankelevitz, one of the first who took matters into his hands. He worked as a flight simulation engineer for McDonnell Douglas in the 1980s, and in his spare time he designed and built customized game controllers. As a flight engineer, Yankelevitz was not necessarily specialized in accessible technologies or game controllers, but he was highly knowledgeable in cutting-edge control technologies, such as joysticks and alternative input devices. The initial request to apply his engineering expertise to video game accessibility came from none other than Atari in 1981. Yankelevitz recounts, Atari referred me to a teenage quadriplegic in Pennsylvania who wanted to play video games. He was depressed and his family and church were searching for something to spark his interest in living after his accident. Now, after experimenting with different designs together with this young quadriplegic, Yankelevitz realized that for this audience it was impossible to acquire functional or affordable game controllers on the market. And although Yankelevitz designed and offered a functional prototype to Atari later that year, they rejected it for economic reasons. Yet, anytime a disabled person called Atari looking for an accessible joystick, Atari referred them to Ken, and that is basically how it started. Atari had likely referred Rancho Los Amigos National Rehabilitation Center in Downey to Yankelevitz as well, because the clinic contacted him shortly after. They sought his assistance in designing a control device for Kirk Kilgore, who was a former Olympic volleyball player who was paralyzed from the neck but had limited mobility left in his head and shoulders. And Kilgore was desperate to play video games. Together with Kilgore and other young patients, including children, Yankelevitz started testing various devices and methods. And after periods of 4 months of experimentation, this collaboration ultimately resulted in the creation of one of the first mouth-operated game controllers that was compatible with the leading gaming consoles, which were most notably the Atari 2600. So as you can see in this small image here, this controller features a lollipop-shaped disc that Kilgore can grab onto with his teeth. The joystick is mounted on a stand which clamps to a table on his wheelchair tray. This lollipop that allows for 4-directional movement is supplemented by a zip and puff tube that functions as the fire button, for example shooting a missile in an Atari game. And this is mounted on the side of the chair was a double pull switch for reset and select functions. And as I said, this is really hard to see here, and this is the problem is that you do not find any better images of this period or any period, to be honest, as far as Yankelevitz's work is concerned. But these still images here are the best we can get. And here you can see this is this lollipop-shaped stick I was talking about. And here you can see 2 children using the same technology to play an Atari game and the modified system, as you can see here. Yankelevitz recognized that the players' bodies and their mobility varied greatly, so he crafted controller systems tailored to the specific needs of his clients. This allowed the operation of the game with the hands, the head, the tongue, or feet. His go-to approach was to examine common joystick models such as the CX40, dismantle them, and recombine their parts with additional components such as telephone keypads. He also used existing devices used in the clinic such as sensitive switches, large buttons, or the zip and puff controls. The patients, drawing on their unique physical characteristic, preferences, and individual experiences, contributed greatly by suggesting ideas, designs, and refinements. An example for such a custom build is John Carasic's control system. This was a then 12-year-old patient with cerebral palsy who, according to Ken, has almost no control over the muscles in his body. John's favorite game then was Asteroids, which requires players to activate the right, left, and fire buttons of the joystick. So Ken rewired touch-sensitive switches to the circuit board of a standard Atari controller. 2 switches were then attached on the head plate of John's wheelchair, as you can see here, allowing him to steer the spaceship in any direction by moving his head. A further switch that activates the fire button is attached to his wheelchair on his left knee, where he has enough muscle control to rapidly fire the spaceship's cannon. While this contraption allowed John to move only in 2 directions in 1983, after some training with the head switch, John realized that he could also use his foot. Ken then used this information to complete John's accessible control system, enabling him to play games that required a 4-directional control scheme by attaching a button board to his wheelchair's footrest. You can see here in the enlarged image, and this controller type by Yankelevitz later on became a standardized input device. Spread by word of mouth, Yankelevitz's efforts circulated in disabled gamer communities, and it didn't take long before he became swamped with similar requests. Consequently, in 1981, he founded his company KY Enterprises and started the production of a series of versatile accessible controllers. Remarkably, he handcrafted his products in his spare time from his workshop at home in Long Beach, California, essentially on his own with the occasional help of his 2 daughters and his wife Diane. Although he continued to offer tailored solutions, he was able to develop a range of standardized designs that could be used by a broader population of gamers with disabilities. You can see some of them here. The standard models were those successfully introduced and tested in Los Ranchos, such as the head switch, a device similar to that of John Carasic's game system, or a wrist controller. You can see here you can use that with your wrist, and there's no need for grabbing, for example, a joystick. By 1982 at the latest, Yankelevitz began promoting his controllers in popular video game and computer magazines. He was featured in several newspaper articles, oftentimes praising Ken's work and highlighting the need for video game accessibility. In the image to the right, you can see Yankelevitz in his workshop presenting a mobile and accessible game system. Nonetheless, the most widely recognized and advertised controllers from KY Enterprises were the mouth-operated sip and puff controller and the so-called Fingertip Controller with no joystick. This controller was originally designed by Yankelevitz for and with persons with arthritis or cerebral palsy who required sensitive buttons and faced barriers with the quick wrist response standardized joysticks required. The design addressed a critical issue. Traditional joysticks often posed significant barriers for individuals with one-hand mobility, muscle weakness, or those who needed to play using their mouth. For example, in Atari's CX40 joystick, the distance between the stick and the fire button was too far to allow simultaneous navigation and firing using either the mouth or a single hand, a requirement for nearly all games on the market at that time. And then with its clustered design, keeping all 4 directional buttons in a diamond-shaped group, the fingertip controller allowed for rapid, one-handed steering. Additionally, the Atari joystick was fairly unresponsive and required considerable force and hand movement to press the buttons. In contrast, the fingertip controller avoids this through light touch buttons, and as a less specialized device similar to arcade controls, it also appealed to non-disabled users. So this is probably the most widely sold device by Ken Yankelevitz. And by the way, this is the one that is put at the footrest of John Carasic's wheelchair. By 1998, Ken Yankelevitz had shifted his specialization primarily to the mouth-operated sip and puff controller, which he marketed under the name Quad Control. Despite this specialization, Yankelevitz continued to play a central role in advancing the field and offering custom adjustments and personal service. So here you can see some images of the use and a schematic sketch of this quad controller on his webpage. During the late 1980s, the Atari joystick began to lose its popularity. Game manufacturers increasingly shifted towards their own controller and connector designs, tailored exclusively for their own systems, such as the Super Famicom by Nintendo or the PlayStation 1994. by Sony. The most problematic issues, however, was the steady growth in complexity of controllers and games, 3D graphics that required enhanced hand-eye coordination, simultaneous button presses, and reactive responses to in-game prompts. This growth of complexity is most notably reflected in the growing complexity of controllers themselves, marked by the proliferation of buttons and additional control elements. This trend culminated in Sony's DualShock controller for the PlayStation, which featured a groundbreaking total of 17 buttons, which is still a common number in controller design, by the way. While such an adjustment might be unproblematic for players using both hands, it posed a significant challenge for Ken's clients, who often played primarily with their mouth. Yankelevitz's response to this trend was, of course, the addition of further input elements for his controllers and relying on one single functional design, the sip and puff foundation of the mouth-operated controllers that was compatible with different consoles. In this sketch of the standard quad controller, you can see how many input options were now available. Besides two fire buttons that could be operated by the upper and lower lip, the mouth control panel was equipped with 3 sip and puff tubes. 2 replaced the 4 shoulder buttons of a PlayStation 1 controller, and the third tube was used for 2 other fire buttons. The control panel was also supported by a joystick, which, through precise movements of the mouth, replaced the directional analog joystick. It is evident that such a complex contraption requires a high level of practice and finesse in the player's use of their mouth, which Ian rather aptly refers to as oral acrobatics. Until 2011, Ken offered his mouth controller for several consoles through his online store. By that time, the now 69-year-old had reportedly handcrafted over 700 controllers. He eventually decided that due to his advanced age and his Parkinson, he could no longer continue this time-intensive craft. He also knew that there was no suitable successor to take over this much-needed service. This left many gamers without the means to continue playing games. And since the game industry's stance on accessibility had remained unchanged since the 1980s, the industry simply wasn't an option. Journalist Stephen Dockery then published several articles on Yankelevitz and his dilemma in 2011 across numerous newspapers, as you can see here. Among the readers of these articles was Fred Davison, a computer engineer with profound experience who contacted Yankelevitz to work on a new prototype. Davison was aware that while he could serve as Ken's successor, he could also refine and enhance the design and engineer the circuit boards himself. By 2014, Davison had developed a functional prototype that had a joystick, 4 sip and puff sensors, a lip position sensor, and a push switch connected to a 32-bit ARM processor that converts the sensor inputs into USB and Bluetooth signals for host devices. Although this design was superior to Yankelevitz's quad controller and was even suitable for competitive online gaming, its development and manufacturing process was significantly more expensive. For this reason, Davison launched a Kickstarter project, the QuadStick, which was a remarkable success and remains one of the most important accessible gaming devices. Ken Yankelevitz died in 2016, but his legacy, the QuadStick, is now endorsed by many disabled gamers and charity organizations such as Able Gamers. It is also showcased by professional streamers such as Rocky No Hands and celebrated in gaming magazines. It is even advertised by Microsoft. Ultimately, the QuadStick is steadily gaining recognition as a milestone in accessible gaming history, and it is a worthy continuation of Ken Yankelevitz's pioneering work in accessible gaming. I have reached the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. And if you're interested in having a closer look at the images I used, here is the list of references where you can find the images I used in my talk. Have a nice day.